Thank you for being here today, especially during lunch hour when I know it's a hard crowd to gather. But I'm deeply grateful to you, Dean Pollock L1, for inviting me to speak this afternoon, and it was a great pleasure meeting you yesterday. And I know it's an enduring friendship that we have just begun. And Kay Brown, I love you, thank you. Okay, I don't possess the improvisational dexterity of my acting colleagues, so this is heavily scripted, so just bear with me. But hopefully the work that I show you today will speak for itself. I am deeply indebted to CAPLA, along with the School of Theater, Film, and Television, because both colleges recognized my passion for exploring something that was, at the time, outside of the defined curriculum which I was studying. I discovered that I wanted to create the worlds for characters and stories on the stage, and the narrative structure became important for me in all the design work that I was doing at CAPLA. And they helped me to take those first early steps towards that dream of being a set designer. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about how I came to do that and what it is exactly that I do. Some people are not, it can be a sort of elliptical definition sometimes, and then I'll talk about my process a little bit. And hopefully there's some time to talk about questions at the end if there are any that come up. And yeah, so I just want to show you how I basically demonstrate meaning to form and serve a narrative structure, which is why I began this adventure in the beginning. I try to use design to convey meaning and insight, however subtly and sometimes boldly, depending on the project. And very often I adapt my own design personality and taste to accomplish those tasks, to best serve the project that I'm designing. I grew up here, so my taste leans to the abstract and to the more brutalist architecture, things like that. And so this image behind me is a play by Terrence McNally called It's Only a Play, which I designed on Broadway a few years ago. Philip Rosenberg was the designer of this. His mom is right there, Emily Pollock, and he's a dear friend of mine. This is not exactly the kind of work that I might have imagined doing when I was in architecture school here. But it's important for me to be a design chameleon, to be good at what I'm doing, and also to serve the work that I'm doing in the best way possible. And I always find the excitement and the challenge in doing that, fully embracing the work and the text. So on this project, when the curtain went up, there were a lot of gasps and laughter, which is a great way to kick off a comedy. The details of the set, there's a silver-plated exercise bike, and it's all introducing a character that's played by Megan Mullally, who owned this Upper East Side townhouse where the play takes place. And there's like a series of exaggerated moldings, extreme false perspective to the shape of the room, the champagne color of the whole set. It really set the tone for her character. Nathan Lane, Matthew Broderick, Stockard, Channing were all in this piece, and we had a great time making this. So I grew up in Yuma. I didn't know a lot about theater. I was always interested in art and drawing in houses, and I always loved driving around looking at houses. And when I saw the Tony Awards first as a child, I was fascinated by the scale models that the designers made. And then that was back when the Tonys showed those disciplines, the costume, lighting, and scenery. And I was really grateful that you could see that process. Now it's not so apparent on TV during that broadcast. But I don't think without that exposure, I don't think I would have found it so directly that that's what I wanted to do. So I sat and looked at that time, looking at these artists, thinking, God, they have really elaborate hobbies, these people. What is the day job? Because I couldn't process that was their actual profession. I was raised in this small desert town where probably being an architect or an art teacher was the most avant-garde job in town. And so I pursued that love of houses and art and studied architecture here at the U of A, which I loved. And as we got further into design studios, I found I was drawn to studying and making spaces that considered how a person felt in them, and not just as a programmatic sidebar, that became my interest. The emotional content became the driving force for the work that I was doing here. I took a semester abroad at the encouragement of my brilliant professor and mentor here, Bob Nevins, and studied in Italy. It became very important for me to kind of look beyond the world in which I was raised. What I found most intriguing was the work of Italian Baroque architects. And Borromini was fascinating to me. There was a plasticity of form that he created and a masterful use of false perspective, design characteristics that I'm still fascinated by today. Here are some images of his that I revisit whenever I'm back in Rome, and Palladio's Teatro Olimpico here with its extreme sense of exaggerated perspective was massively influential. You can see even the ground plan, how it's just shaped. St. Peter's was a huge one for me, because Bernini's work in architecture and sculpture were also massively playing with perception. When you walk into this colonnade at St. Peter's, it's a wonder-inducing, almost anxiety-provoking curve that leads you into the unseen terminus, where you merge at the point where the cathedral's facade is at its most impactful, all by design. They were each impressive and thoughtful spaces to me that explored form and generated emotional responses and content. Responses from the viewer, which was something that I became obsessed with. I've jumped ahead visually, but I'm going to hold there for a minute. So I took these influences back to me and to my studies here in Arizona, and took the set design course in the fine arts department. And it was for majors only, had prerequisites, but the advisors from both colleges were instrumental and saw how deeply serious I was studying theater. So they were able to kind of make that happen. So I remain completely indebted to both colleges for that. I got that degree in architecture, which I loved, and I knew I wanted to study theater at a graduate level. So I moved to New York, where I worked in retail for a bit, and then ended up becoming an art director and a set director in independent film, and then applied to the Yale School of Drama, where I received my MFA in design. Okay, so a little bit. So I'm just going to try to run through some work, and we'll give you some context of the project. And I don't want to keep us here forever. So this theater is a tricky one to kind of show and to document, because it's largely ephemeral and intangible, and it's hard to capture in photographs the moments that give you goosebumps or chills or elicit that desired emotional response. But my goal, and the thing that I find the most rewarding, is when you create them. And hopefully they remain with you longer after you've left the theater. This was a new play by David Mamet that I did in 2008 called November, with Nathan Lane and Laurie Metcalf, directed by Joe Mantello. I'm currently designing the revival of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf with Laurie and Rupert Everett, and being directed by Joe Mantello, and we start that tomorrow. This play is about, ironically, about a slightly vulgar president getting ready for re-election, and everything is going wildly wrong. I know, it's astonishing. 11 years before its time, this play. I took the idea of the Oval Office and exaggerated it into an extreme false perspective, almost a Fabergé egg, and put it on stage within a larger blue box. All the surfaces within it are paled out so that these Memetian characters, with their strong language and their bold personas, end up like Sharpie marker strikes against this bleached field of color behind them. This is what it looked like in reality. It was a huge challenge for the prop team, and I worked with many craftsmen in my job: prop fabricators, furniture makers, set dressers. In this case, even the drapery was sewn in false perspective. You can see how the moldings are very small in the center, and then they just get more and more exaggerated as they sweep upward on the downstage edge. For this particular project, the rehearsal room was an intense one, and we had been rehearsing for quite a while without the rake stage, and all the furniture was in the room with them. So when we moved the sofa into this room, it didn't work in perspective. So it didn't diminish upstage. So it was the only thing that kind of let you know something was a little off kilter in the room. So what I did, and I didn't tell anybody, and I certainly didn't tell Nathan, was that every day for a week and a half, I had the props makers backstage shave off a 32nd of an inch of the two upstage sofa legs, so that it would drop into proper perspective in front of the wainscoting by the time we had our first audience. And Nathan never noticed his feet getting slightly closer to the floor. So cut this from your tape. But that's just an example of one of the challenges that you have to anticipate. And there's always going to be something that comes up that you're not sure. And having a dexterity in the room and commanding how to solve that is a great and important skill to have. Even within, I think you can barely see it. Right here, there was a stack of legal books. Dylan Baker was his lawyer. Shoved in the middle of it was a first edition of Cujo by Stephen King, and I have it in my office now. But it was one thing that maybe 8 people kind of saw, but it was such a thing for the character, and the director loved it, and it was also Nathan thought it was great, and you just kind of, I enjoy getting to the small details. This is a model for a project that I did with New York Times Magazine. They asked me to collaborate with my twin brother, who's a men's fashion director. And so on this quick job I started playing with scale, and I did this with an actor named Sam Riley, who was doing a movie at the time about Joy Division called Kroll, and it was great playing with this highly detailed object. And I had been doing a Shakespeare play that had gotten canceled, so it was still on my brain, and I said I just wanted to keep playing with it. And I always enjoy designing spaces with a certain state of decay. I'm most often hired by a director, sometimes a producer on a project, and they assemble a team a multidisciplinary team that includes costume, lighting, and sound. A lot of us work together a lot. Sometimes it can be the first time, but hopefully together we're supporting a shared vision about a project. And most often it's an approach that we evolve together over many discussions and throughout the entire design process. It's a misconception that I'm kind of handed a design idea and that I go off into a cave and turn it into a model and arrive on the first day of rehearsal. My role is really to be a design director and work very, very closely with everyone on the team. And I'm basically responsible for everything on stage except the clothes, so the silverware, anything that an actor touches. So, and in my training at Yale, we were really taught to think as directors, and very often we're creating the narratives, conceiving our projects as well as designing them. So we were really educated in a strong dramaturgical point of view. The design process, as a lot of you know who are studying, can be incredibly elliptical. It can be a ton of back and forth, exploration, false starts, wrong directions, and then sometimes it can, and before you get to the answer that you feel is the right and the most appropriate, sometimes it can be incredibly direct and highly focused. And that's a part of the process that I really enjoy, just that whole idea of discovery. This was an extreme reimagining of a famous Chekhov play called The Three Sisters, taking place in 1901 in a Russian provincial town. This is the model for that. The director was a man called John Doyle, who's very famous for his stripped-down productions, and we've done many plays together. He said to me, we're doing this show, I don't want to see any birch trees. And I said, good, that's how I want to roll on this one too, because famously each of these productions, birch trees are kind of ever present. So we placed our production within the context of a ruined Russian palace and pressed layers of history upon it, telling it almost in modern day. And then so long after the fall of the Russian Empire, that imperial room was imagined to be inhabited by a series of other inhabitants, a communist office, and then say after the lifting of the borders and the openness to Western society, ultimately abandoned. So it might have been a stretch for the more naturalistic minded, but it supported the director's view very precisely and his approach to how this family and their quest to get to Moscow. This was the model. Now they're seeing the production. I usually go very quickly from thumbnails into a model, and this was how this one was remained very close to the model. I'm going to toggle back and forth. That was the sort of quarter-inch model, and then the reality. This was an early sketch for a project I did on Broadway called Les Liaisons Dangereuses with Ben Daniels and Laura Linney. The director, who's now the head of the Royal National Theatre in London, he just wanted to explore how we present this play about vanity and indulgent mischief of the privileged, sharply contrasting the growing unrest of the underprivileged and the servant classes of the time. So what I did is I created this very sharply angled 18th century room painted at high gloss black. The floors were reflective black Lexan. And there was a contemporary glass wall that sliced through the entire space that was made of two-way mirror. Throughout the show, there was a presence of the servant class behind that glass wall. You could see them shuffling along, or sometimes they would stand aligned collectively to witness a particularly cruel moment of deceit or humiliation. I felt it was important that the audience be aware that the onstage machinations of the characters were being monitored, foreshadowing the end of the monarchy. And that glass wall, in a way how it cut diagonally across the entire space, was my onstage nod to the guillotine that would be slicing through their necks 3 years later in 1789. There's Laura, and the costumes were incredible. There was a bit of a blob of fabric that you saw early in that model, and that became a space definer for various rooms in the mansion, and it evolved through the night, and you start to see the rigging as it kind of fell down through the evening, and more it became this kind of tragic web that the characters were caught in ultimately. This is an early sketch for Peter Grimes, an opera by Benjamin Britten that I did for the Metropolitan Opera with the same director as the Chekhov play. It takes place in a British East Coast fishing town. The man, Peter Grimes, is a societal outcast who's been cleared at the beginning of the opera of an accidental death of an apprentice. But it's a huge choral opera, and it's an incredible dramaturgy about the notion of mob justice and the abstracted space that I created on stage that would shift and shape and move to just create a pub, his net hut, and then this is a sketch of the very end when all of that compression had kind of just evaporated by the end, and he is forced to commit suicide at sea after the death of his second apprentice, both of them accidental. So I present these sketches to the Met, and then the head said, basically gives you the thumbs up and said, please proceed. So these are some of the looks of the opera. This was a massive model, about half-inch scale. What I loved as much about this process was the idea of having this incredibly clear conceptual approach to something that was taking this small town's rush to judgment and translating that visually. That's Peter in the net hut just before you can see a church scene. So the notion of judgment is ever present, and that huge wall would move up and down and just shift and change to kind of create this expansion and compression all evening. The very last moment in Peter's hut before he's sent to sea, and then those parted and it was clear. Scheduling a project can be an important aspect of my life, and some take years. Operas can take 3 to 4. Musicals as well, plays usually less. This was a production called Steady Rain that I did with Daniel Craig and Hugh Jackman. We initially were planning to do this in London, and then Hugh expressed interest to do the second part of it, which we call a 2-person play, a two-hander. So we moved it to Broadway. His kids were going to school, so we got into theater very quickly. It was scripted to take place in an interrogation room, but the director and I felt that naturalistic approach to it wasn't properly serving the sort of surreality of the story and kind of almost ghost story nature of it. So I drew these thumbnails very early in the process. And you find out at the very end that it's all been enacted in real time, but one of the characters is actually dead and retelling the story as though he's alive. So when the curtain went up on both Daniel and Hugh downstage, they were on a concrete platform, 2 feet from the front row of the audience. There was this gasp, and then we just ran on with it. And I loved that, the immediacy when you have these two, titans on the stage, and you're presented the idea of how can we make this like just a shocking evening, just start there right out of the gate. There were 4 significant locations in the recounting of events in the story. So I started the set making them exist in a black void, kind of side by side. I did the costumes on this as well, and as I often do when I work with a British director. So these visions, this is another vision of the model. So there were 4 significant locations in this sort of police drama, and they would show up. The whole set was made out of these knife-edged portals that were black, so no light would catch them. So it could exist in a true black void and just catch light for the guys. And then these visions would show up behind black scrim, and all the automation was done incredibly quietly and very, very slowly. Everything backstage was carpeted so that there was no noise at all, so that these really would just appear magically. These are just some of the early thumbnails, and you can see the extreme perspective of these. They drifted and moved. This is a scene right now in the mall where one is moving off left and another one is coming on, and various lights for the story when they're talking about an apartment would pop on. This is the actual set. And that whole piece of scenery was probably about 18 inches deep, so it was very, very shallow. And the last scene took place in a forest. And so that showed up right behind that scrim as well. This was a revival of a musical 9 that I did with Chita Rivera and Jane Krakowski and Antonio Banderas in 2003. That's scripted to take place in an Italian spa with a Fellini-esque director who's lost his inspiration for a film. So the women in his life try to inspire him to finish this movie. And the director and I wanted to explore contemporary architecture. And so I was inspired by the work of Carlo Scarpa. And I'd been to Verona and seen the museum that he'd done there and installed and designed so beautifully and skillfully how it drifted through the ancient shell of this stunning building. And so I designed this so the past and the future could kind of coexist and commingle on stage. This is the model. And you see how it just revealed itself over time. This glass wall had pivoting doors, and his muses would kind of arrive in various ways, and then the glass wall would fly out. Each woman descended through from that spiral staircase into the room, and then upstage. There was a huge mural of 3 Graces and a mosaic that we made, and a canal of water there. And there's a curtain that revealed them I'd been playing with a FedEx envelope and holding it up to the desk lamp, and the texture that came through it was so beautiful. And so I asked the shop if we could fireproof that, and we figured out a way. So we had this immense curtain of Tyvek made and sewn, and that would be drawn across the stage when this was revealed. And that wall upstage wept water into a canal, which then filled that disc downstage there. This is actually now filled with water. And they start stopping around in the room on these plexiglass chairs. And then at a moment, very precise, and it was all timed by computer, Jane was singing a moment, and it started to flood over this glass edge and into the catch trough down below. And it just became this part of rhythm, this musical rhythm to her song. And at the end, when his muses leave him, just after this, they climbed up that stair, and we were faced with these incredible actresses, all of the entire height of it. And at that moment, during the last strains of the song, there were 3 electromagnets, one at each level, that disengaged quietly. So like during the last bit of music, the spiral staircase revolved, and then the lights went out. And it was just people kind of getting that gasp at the end of the show. You thought it was finished, and that was the end. And then this last little moment that just being this grace note of such beauty because of them being so kind of astonishing. It's a quick sketch for a play that I did called The Ritz. This was in the theater at Studio 54. This is the full-scale model. It's basically a caper comedy in a gay bathhouse. Comic timing, how fast can a person get from here to there, slamming doors. And the director and I decided to play with this big phallic centerpiece in the middle of it and see who would figure it out. There were great moments in the show of just the challenge of how do you make something like this visually interesting to us and that has something to say. And Rosie Perez was in this, and she was hysterical. And it's largely about adapting to the physical and comic timing of the needs of a play. Oops, look at that. This was the first sketches for a revival of the musical Pal Joey with that same director in that same space the following season, taking place in the underworld of Chicago's nightlife in the 30s. I'll start trying to burn through these, I think. So incredible false perspective. There was a mirrored fissure in the middle that would sort of erupt different bits of scenery. A diner would show up there. Stockard Channing's apartment, where she's saying bewitched, bothered, and bewildered, was revealed. And you just provide a little bit of context to let people fill in the rest with their imaginations. William Ivy Long, remarkable 7-time Tony Award-winning costume designer, did the clothes for this. Behanding in Spokane, I've worked very often with Martin McDonough, and he's done a few great movies in Bruges, 3 Billboards. This was a play with Chris Walken and Sam Rockwell, who I'm also working with now on a revival of American Buffalo for Broadway this spring. Anthony Mackie and Zoe Kazan were also in this. I did the sets and the costumes, and I enjoy doing them for plays, and very often when I'm working in England, where I do them both. especially plays where I feel like I can control the whole universe, and I appreciate that moment when I have it. The director for this, John Kroll, is an incredible film director as well, and we did Steady Rain together, and this was following that play in the same theater. Chris plays a character who's had his hand cut off many, many years before, severed by some thugs that put his hand on a train track and ran off with the hand. So my goal for the dark comedy was to create an environment, an atmosphere, and mood that matched the tone of the story being told on stage, and to exaggerate it to a kind of gothic proportion, respecting the reality of the needs of the script. So I began with a sketch based on a reference by an artist, Gordon Matta Clark, where he would cut holes in various buildings downtown Manhattan in the early 60s. So my first sketch for this was taking that room and just slicing through it all, so you would see the beams and the structure of the walls of it. And that was how we began. And then we jumped into model mode. There's Chris. He's extraordinary man. When we were working on this together, he would call me up and he'd say, "Scott, I just saw this movie, Bad Day at Black Rock, with Spencer Tracy. He does the whole thing. He's supposed to have lost his hand, but he does it with his hand in his pocket." And I said, "Okay, Chris, but like that was 1955. That was film. These people are going to be 2 feet away from you. So let's keep going." So he was great. He was always just so wanted to make sure that looked believable, and so we worked really, really hard. I worked very closely with a huge team of prop people here on this, but also very closely with a person like our prosthetic designer. I'm trying to skip to this place where I can talk about that. So yeah, it's like this show wasn't given the green light until Chris signed off on that. So it was a very involved process for about 2 months. Me working with this prosthetic designer upstate, taking Chris in for fittings, and we carved it. We had multiple molds done. It was a very gnarled thing. And then I was also doing costume sketches for this so that we would alter seams on garments and things so it could just almost throw this asymmetry around so you weren't paying attention to arm lengths and things like that. So it was quite an elaborate process. Let me get to those sketches. Sam Rockwell. He had these very monologues that would happen during the play, and that we had this tatty curtain that would creak across that railing up above that looked like the kind of train tracks. There were all these like just little soft, subtle gestures that we had to kind of just create atmosphere of this sort of dark and moody comedy, really. Those were all old bathroom fixtures that were made into footlights. This is the moment when the character carries around this suitcase of his severed hands that he's collected over 20 years, and there's a moment in the play when it explodes. And very often, one of them would end up in the front row, and they would kind of gingerly put it back on the deck. But one day, one guy walked off with it. So these were the costume sketches I did, and this was me kind of dissecting how I was going to approach how to make Chris. He worked with there was a sling on the underside of the garment, and he actually showed up for this fitting one day you can see in the sketch here, the original one, he was in trousers and I had him in these old brogues, but he showed up to the fitting in pajama pants and his slippers, and I just said, "Chris, can I buy you a new pair of shoes, and can I use those pajama pants?" And we did, and he loved it, and Ben Brantley in the New York Times called it out as one of his favorite costumes of the season. Because it just made this character much more vulnerable. There's an incredible monologue that he has with his mother where he's shouting back and forth, and she's basically discovered his porn collection. So it was a great, great, great project, and just incredible people. But yeah, I was sweating stress bullets because we had him come on stage. I suited him up. He walked around. The director had flown in from London and just waiting for Chris to approve or disapprove this costume in order to do the play. And he just looked up at me and goes, "Okay." And he walked out. And the director and I went immediately to lunch and downed a bottle of wine. I'm just going to spin through quickly a couple. These are just some of the documents. You can this is the drafting for It's Only a Play. So you can see how the perspective is just completely forced. A lot of it's for sight lines because we've got seats over here. But some of it's also even just for me wanting the room to kind of present itself in a much more sort of ambitious way. And usually I work, in this way we do work like architects. There are probably 30 plates of drafting for this particular show. And then it goes to the engineers for the shops that are going to build it. So I've designed a few exhibitions for the New York Botanical Garden. This one was the first one, their Orchids Show, which is a big annual event in New York, and they had a theme called On Broadway that year. So they came to me to design it, which I enjoyed very, very much. Just working in a context of completely different from my usual dark rooms during the day kind of thing. And we've worked together a few times since. This was the featured piece when you walked in, and all the swags were made out of garden hose. And I've subsequently designed the Frida Kahlo exhibition for them, which came here to the Tucson Botanical Garden a couple of years ago, which was great to collaborate with them. And I've done Monet's Garden, most recently an exhibition about Georgia O'Keeffe's time spent in Hawaii when she was doing commissioned paintings for Dole. This was The Coast of Utopia, which a premiere of an epic Russian trilogy that I did at Lincoln Center by Tom Stoppard. It was a massive production, three-hour plays, and three lighting designers, a British colleague, set designer and I, and one costume designer, and it was massive. Just showing how we could play with extreme perspective. I think on this, those statues downstage were about 16 feet tall. The street lamps all the way upstage in the back were probably about as tall as my knee. And the actors would just look like it stretched for miles. So I had a great time playing with the depth of that theater because we really used it to its football field abilities. Cirque du Soleil's Amaluna, it's a tent show for them that is still touring the world, and I was the first American designer to work with them. And the process for that project, from blank page to kind of completion, was about 3 to 4 years, and it's been running now for about 7 since we opened in Montreal. The approach was to be as immersive as possible, and I worked with a very frequent collaborator, Diane Paulus, and it was designed within a tent. And we know, most of us know, that a tent really wants to be an umbrella rather than a support for scenery. So everything is kind of ground-based, and the 4 tent poles would support the acrobatic equipment, and otherwise the scenery is very kind of ground-based. So we had the storyline for this was based on sort of Tempest, a riff on Shakespeare's Tempest. So it was a very lyrical approach to kind of creating this magical island. And this was the first show that Cirque had done where the balance of acrobats was heavily weighted toward female artists. And this set existed as a kind of magical island. And it was a great, great experience because I worked with engineers kind of that were the best in their field and in the business. And I designed acrobatic equipment with these just brilliant minds, and I really, really loved it. Lighting, it's just one of the, you see how important this is. I mean, my work is seen through the lens of a lighting designer, and the ability to transform is some of the, like for me, the most important thing about the work that I do, and those close collaborations are very important to me. So I was asked to do the Book of Mormon a few years ago, and that was with Matt and Trey and Bobby Lopez, who had written Avenue Q. That's now been running almost 9 years. When I was young, I had been in a number of church plays, so I took the experience of these liturgical passion plays as sort of source for this musical, and it really influenced the opening of the show for me. And also the idea of creating an architectural frame drew certainly on references in the Mormon temple architecture, but also just gave the story this frame that kind of made it a fable, everything that happened inside of it. But also by animating this frame, it gave it storytelling power. It was like the whole of it was internally illuminated, so it could almost act like a pair of jazz hands to like punctuate moments in the show, create significant, moments of atmosphere. And so the walk-in was this view, and this is at the O'Neill where we premiered. One of my first sketches for Salt Lake City, the rendering, the reality. Josh Gad and Andrew Reynolds originated these roles. And so there's also a sharp contrast between Salt Lake and Uganda. And when we revealed Uganda, where they're forced to have their mission, all of the colors were sharp and crystalline and blue in the first half of the show. And then we get to Uganda and everything is moved into ochres and rusts and the damage of the town. And we'd basically taken the structure of traditional Broadway theater design where you have wings and borders overhead so you can light very well from the sides and scenery can erupt from those sides. Dancers can zip in from there. But what I did is I took them and I tore them and burned them. So like when we left this very crisp, beautiful world of Utah, we get here, like a dead donkey was being dragged across the stage, and you hear this wah wah, and they were like stuck going to do their mission there. I just want to jump back for a second too. Even walking into the theater, it set the tone for the musical. There was this, what I called this inspirational painting. We'd call it the Jesus sunrise. And then if you looked carefully, you would see like there are 3 or 4 planets around. And it just became this kind of combination of inspirational art and then Star Wars colliding. And it was something that Matt and Trey were sort of obsessed with. I mean, Trey loved this whole installation. It was bad. This show, which is one of my favorites, it collectively won 9 Tony Awards, including Best Musical. And then right after that finished, I went across the street and was doing a revival of The House of Blue Leaves with Ben Stiller and Edie Falco and Jennifer Jason Leigh, and a completely different project. It takes place in 1965 on the eve of the papal visit to New York City, and it's a very, very dark comedy. But it was made surreal, like walls wouldn't meet each other. That was all done on an incredibly raked stage, different perspectives. We used a lot of different, like some computer programming just to be able to like plot the view from every seat, like who would be seeing what. So if you were kind of, over here, you had a view of all of it and you would see into that sort of his writer's corner. But if you were over here, you got to see Edie have her kind of walk down the hallway before she would deliver a line. So it wasn't, nobody missed any lines or anything important, but there were these different views of atmosphere that we kind of enjoyed playing around with. At the end of the play, the apartment splits apart. Ben has killed his wife, who's schizophrenic, and it was quite something. I don't think I have a picture of that. This is Pippin. Diane and I, who did this, the director who did this, we had done Cirque and were just hugely influenced by the idea of the traveling circus. And this became a radical reinvention of a musical, which takes place during the medieval reign of Charlemagne. So we conceived it as a sort of traveling medicine show of sorts, and the notion of those shows coming to town and the seeming loss of wonder when they pick up and move on to the next town, leaving the town dreamers kind of wondering, what was that and should I follow that? In this case, Pippin, the character in the circus, does leave and find love and family, and he does kind of let it go on without him. And at the end of our production, to make a poignant statement about the cycle of arrival and leaving and life, we raised the tent very, very slowly during the last strains of the music. And it revealed all the props that we had used all night long, the back wall of the theater, and it just became a sort of very dark kind of punctuation of this. And then Pippin's son, the trapeze would come down, and Pippin's son ran to that, and it began the whole cycle again. The tent unfurled, and we were just kicking off that show one more time to show that cycle. Sketch for a project that I did with Bette Midler called I'll Eat You Last, about a Hollywood agent who was representing Barbra Streisand. And Bette, sat on the sofa, scripted not to move for 90 minutes. In this case, she's anticipating a phone call from Barbara's lawyers that she knows are going to fire her. So the costume designer, Anne Roth, who's a dear friend and won an Academy Award for The English Patient, we were both working on Mormon in London together, and the sofa became a character. So she and I really closely collaborated on what that fabric was. And personally, I'd seen her house, this John Elgin Wolfe house that she had in Beverly Hills, and her estate had just gone up for sale about a few months before. She had just passed away. And she had this incredible peach sofa, which we were just a little too late to get the real thing. And this, again, is another important use of light, and the idea of taking a naturalistic space and then letting it fall apart at the edges. The room, like these stalks of palm trees, the architecture kind of being complete for itself, but then fading away, and walls kind of being taken away as well. And then these were huge glass panes that were commercially fabricated for us. And so as she sits there on that sofa, we watch the lights go from day to dusk. And I devised that hallway upstage for her exit. When the last moment of the play, she finally stands up, balances out herself, grabs a cigarette, and just walks out. And it was kind of her walk into the light at the very end, when she feels her career's decline and her own star had dimmed a bit. But as the lights dimmed during the show, while she was still sitting in that sofa, it was kind of great, and some of it anticipated, some of it not. But what it did was her vulnerability became incredibly present the more that you saw the back of her head reflected in those panes of glass from every angle. And as you started losing more of the front light, and as the room got darker, she became more fragile. We did this show in LA after the Broadway engagement, and the director and I were sitting in the back row the same night that Barbara came. And she showed up with her husband, James Brolin. We knew she was going to be in, but Bette didn't know. And we were all sworn to secrecy because there's a protocol for her to kind of come in. And I have to say, like, Joe was sitting here by me, Barbara and James were right over there, and Joe had his head on my shoulder, kind of going like this the whole time. And I found it to be pretty incredible that she could hold a full, non-responsive face while hurled obscenities are being thrown at her by her onstage agent as she's getting fired. And it was great. This I did at Steppenwolf, and then came to Broadway. It's a play called Airline Highway, and for me it was an exercise in hyperrealism, and figuring out how to do this complete reality was fantastic. I mean, I felt like we could have filmed each of these characters' hotel rooms and when we were done with it. It takes place in New Orleans, on the fringes of society, literally and figuratively, with characters whose livelihoods are serving the people and the tourists who come to town. And this is all post-Katrina in this beaten-down motel. There's some incredible ethereal moments within the play that would allow us to completely transform the space with lighting and time of day, and we parked that car on the stage as well. This is an early model for a musical called The Visit, which was Cantor and Ebb's last musical, who wrote Chicago, again with Chita Rivera, directed by my friend John Doyle. This is about a widow returning with revenge to a small European town. There were numerous scripted locations in the musical, and we decided to create a single poetic crucible that had great meaning, a train station that had been swallowed by neglect and nature in the way that the town was as she arrived. And this is one of my mom's favorite sets and shows. I'm going to try to pick up my pace and come back. So we spent days on cherry pickers weaving vines that we had brought in every day to kind of keep creating this sort of swallowed nature of this. the model for Waitress, musical based on the film with music by Sarah Bareilles, who's amazing. And this process of making this kind of op art or pop art curtain became one of the most Instagrammed things of the show, and an early part of how Instagram has become influential in theater design, actually, or front of house. And that's the model. So just showing how we work through the process and then the reality. And those pie cases on the side spin and during the walk-in, and they're, even in London, we have this running on the West End. There are these pies that are being baked out in this secret room that fill the theater with that smell. And it gets people very hungry at the intermission. My first sketch for Lillian Hellman's play Little Foxes, which I did with Laura Linney and Cynthia Nixon. They alternated roles, and Cynthia won the Tony for this. This is it in the shop. And this was really, I designed the whole set. It was around an exit, and it's right now. And it was Regina, the character. It's about her exit going upstairs. It was all about that. Oh Hello, a play that I did with two incredible comedians, John Mulaney and Nick Kroll, doing characters that they've conceived for quite a few years, these two crass Upper West Side guys. The set was conceived as a conglomeration of scavenged parts of old sets that they had kind of stolen. So, and with a lot of tongue-in-cheek. So you'll see on the left, there's the Cosby Show stoop, and part of a beauty parlor from Steel Magnolias. There's a wall of an August Wilson play on stage left, and the whole portal we decided had been stolen from a traveling production of Fiddler on the Roof. I love my Broadway work, but I'm also very excited when I have different kinds of projects. And this was a huge fashion show that I did for Bottega Veneta, an Italian luxury brand, and it was their first show in New York to celebrate the opening of a flagship on Madison Avenue, and it was a massive production. We did this in the American Stock Exchange building downtown, and it was designed to be this very luxe apartment with a working fireplace, and that was the only source of light on stage when the audience walked in. So each model would, basically the perimeter of the deck was the runway, and there were 70 models, not one repeated look, and Gigi Hadid was the finale. And the way we had done it, I'd used a lot of the Bottega furniture, but then I was pulling in, there's Gio Ponti furniture that I had bought in Europe and sent over and reupholstered. There's a Jonathan Chamberlain sculpture that you'll see in there that was worth $2.5 million that I had one moment to be able to place it. And it was like 12 people on the dollies, and it's like, you like it? And I was like, it looks good, because that's where it's staying. Just incredible opportunity to work with beautiful furniture and art. And I hired the floral designer who'd done the Obama's White House Christmas decor to join my team for some very specific arrangements throughout the onstage space. Those dining tables were dressed with champagne flutes half full and implying the latter part of a party. Upstage is a library. There's the Chamberlain. And this wall here, when the audience walked in, it was down. And so once the whole show was completed, each model, as they finished their walk, they would start populating the space. And there were a bunch gathered in what I called the bar upstage. And at the very end of the show, that concrete wall lifted and erupted all of the models, and then that became the set for the after party. So the entire audience got up and we had the party in that room, and then I stayed till 2 a.m. to clear it and then re-prep it, because I did the shoot for the campaign with Japanese Vogue. So it was a long day, but it was great. The following weekend, I did a one-day load-in of a set for comedian John Mulaney and for his 7-night. Actually, I'll stay with this for a second. Let's go to details. This was the backstage room where the models would go through when they were finished, and we decided to make that a sort of an Instagram space. And so I had them do, like, we found this incredible chair, and mirrored the entire thing, and then I had buried LED strips in various areas, but it became this, again, very heavily Instagrammed moment for that night. The editor-in-chief of Town and Country has now become a pal after that. This was the set that I did for John Mulaney. This was one of the early renderings that I showed him. He sold Radio City out for 7 nights straight. Netflix approached us to do a special. We shot it over a couple of performances on the weekend, and it was a blast. John won an Emmy for the special and was incredibly generous with his shout-outs. Radio City was very kind to me. Recently they called. They needed to match the fabric that I had done for it because they said it was the closest that they'd ever had to their main drape, which was an incredibly huge curtain. And one of them said to me, they said it was her favorite set she's ever seen in there. It's things like that. When the backstage people come to you and take you aside, those are the compliments that I take most to heart. There's John. This is an early sketch for the band's visit, which won 10 of the 11 nominations, and it won Best Musical in 2018. It takes place in a small desert town in Israel where an Egyptian police band is stranded after a mispronounced city name at a bus station led them to the wrong town in the middle of nowhere. And a lyric in this song inspired the turntable and the ring that spins around to deliver people and shift to its modest locations in the town. And basically it takes place one night of the local townsfolk being kind to these outsiders and strangers from Egypt. And the most beautiful score. And the only nomination it lost was mine for the Tonys because I was nominated with Mean Girls as well. So, Mean Girls. This was great. I mean, also I feel like the desert had a big part here. There's a horizon line that went around the whole building or the whole set on stage, and we used tons of sand and grit and texture to really kind of create that horizon line that I find so important and that I come back to here so often. You can just see it kind of hovering around here. It was based on photographs of the desert outside of these towns. This is a model for Mean Girls. I'm getting to the end here. This we did largely with storyboard because it was a huge set of LED panels and conceived really to keep pace with Tina Fey's incredibly fast-moving story here, and it was really a blast. Set for a recent production that we just tried out in Chicago for August Rush. And then this is where I come to collapse, my place here. Thank you for being here so much, and thanks for taking your lunch hour.
Okay, 10 minutes. I know there's
Oh, good. No, perfect.
a lot of questions. So, questions. First of all, thank you. Fantastic. But, so you're working on multiple projects at one time with a team.
Yes.
So you're getting this, but you're in the middle of that.
Correct. Yeah.
Is that really challenging? Yeah, it must be really challenging.
I like juggling things. I like having multiple balls in the air. It can get intense, but I sort of know my tipping point pretty well. So I think it's important to know that because it's important that I'm in the room. It's different from an architect because I can't just pop on into a site visit when it is calendar-wise, I'll, like where there's a couple days difference, like won't make a huge difference. I have to be present during those on-stage rehearsals. So if there are projects that are overlap, sometimes I've had to say I'm sorry to like something that was heartbreaking because of that. But yeah.
Scott, I think your drawings are amazing and sketches. And
Oh, thanks.
I sometime you're archiving them, of course, but maybe you can share those. And I can't speak for the college.
Sure you can.
Okay, I think it would be wonderful for the college and the university, both sides of the street here, for you to bring those here someday for a full exhibit, whether it's in.
That's very kind. Thank you very much. Thank you.
We all get a chance to share those.
Thanks. Thanks so much.
That was my question. Also, what do you do with all your models?
I have a storage space out in Long Island. So, yeah. I mean, I'm probably not so great with my care of all of that because for me, I think it's all such a process and it's one little part of it. And then the ending result is, again, this ephemeral thing that is there and then it's gone. So I always just, the process is so important to me and I don't value one more than the other. I mean, I try to keep the drawings together and the models are kept in a pretty good shape, but I'm not as maniacal about the archiving as I probably should be. Lincoln Center has approached me about doing it, so we're in conversation. Oh, but they have to have sharing skills. They can't hoard it.
I have one more. That is the performers. Do you interact with them in the process of rehearsals and assemblies and adjustments to scenes that don't always work with the movement of the actors?
Yeah, always. I'm always on stage, especially introducing them to the room that they're going to be working in is one of the most important things. Then in the first day in the rehearsal room, I walk through them, however elaborately. If it's a set for a play, it's a much simpler presentation. If it's something that's a musical, it's a big, like this, where we go through each of the sequences and the whole cast will be sitting there and so that you introduce them to it. And then once they're on stage, I'm with them. We all get to be really good friends. And backstage, if there's anything, I'm kind of there. And then once we open, they're like, "Where'd you go?" Because then I'm on to the next. So I pop in and visit. And some you're more intensely involved than others. It depends on the nature of the show and what it is. Yeah. Okay.
It was fascinating to see your work and hear about your process. One of the things that was going through my mind is it seems like you've really done a wide range of work and wondering about how budget plays a role in what you can do. Just curious.
Yeah, it's always a factor. And more those budgets are getting tighter and tighter. Things have to be lean and mean in order to become profitable, especially in the commercial theater. Yeah, it's something that we always have to be very mindful of. And when we go through a budgeting process, and some shows, yeah, you can find that wildly you're over budget, and even though it's been monitored all the way along, you're like, whoa, we've got to really rope this one in, because for the show to run, at least on Broadway, its weekly cannot be out of control, because then it means the show's going to close. So it benefits everybody involved to be very mindful of that. And usually what I do when I have a concept for a play early on or a musical, there's a technical team that comes in from the fabricating shops, and they will sit with me very, very early on, especially if there's automation, because that's what can ratchet up expenses very quickly. I mean, the deck and band's visit, over $100,000, easy, like probably 150. And so when those expenses go into something like that, which is not visually impactful, that I find heart-robbing. I mean, it's very difficult, and you have to have it, because the techniques of it are incredibly important, but you've got to set that aside and be, okay, if the entire budget is 1.3 million or whatever, that much of it is going to something that nobody is going to, it's not going to impact them at all. So you're incredibly wise to pick that up. It's important, and it will close a show if it has bad economics.
And just a quick follow-up. So you're saying, it makes sense, I hadn't thought about it, but that you have to budget not only for building the set, but then there's also costs for
running costs. Yeah.
All of that.
Yeah. And there's a whole production team that jumps in. I mean, I'm a small part of the whole process, but the production team will have an outline budget, and there's a weekly budget as well. Because on Broadway, actors are paid by the week, and The crew is paid by the week. The automation expenses, they're all budgeted. Oh, say that thing is moving left to right. That winch is going to cost that much a week. So there's an installation cost, and then there's a cost for the running of the show. And then, on Variety, you can look and you can see what the show's made each week or what the gross was, and you know what what we call the nut of the show, and you know when it's profitable. So yeah, exactly right.
You talked about the narrative,
Mm-hmm.
trying to find. Do you feel, I'm not saying this the right way, but do you feel sometimes that you're writing a play parallel to the play?
Sure, I feel like I'm doing the visual correlation, and I mean, I don't want to. I have to be very careful about. Well, it also depends on what the director's approaches are too, because sometimes if they're like, oh, we're going to do the Sam Shepard play, but we're going to do it in a cradle because all those actors are acting like children. Well, that's a very abstract way to go, but it supports the narrative. And this goes back to a project that I did here as a student. Those characters are behaving like children, but we still have the demands of the play to do in that room. So what if you take those ideas, and what I did on the project here is like, I'm going to take the furniture, I'm going to make it a little bigger, and I'm going to take the wall covering on the wall and make it pastel. And you start infusing it with these things that some people might not even know, but when you see the behavior and you see it all kind of come together, God, he looks just a little too small in that chair. And it starts to kind of create a world that isn't jarringly distracting from the narrative. And I'm using just this one example because it just popped into my head. But yeah, I'm always kind of searching for how can I convey meaning in a way that may just even be subtle or something that people might not even recognize right off the bat, but that seeps into them emotionally. But yeah, that's one way.
You mentioned that Mr. Brown was changing a little bit the way that you design.
Yeah.
Are there any other characteristics of the contemporary audience?
Well, Waitress was an interesting one because we did that. I very often work at Harvard where the artistic director, we try out shows there and then they'll make their way to Broadway, and Waitress was one of them. And I remember back then, people were taking pictures of that curtain like crazy and posting it, and the union was actually getting upset about it. And so I just said to them, I said, you guys, I understand your feeling about the duplication of work uncredited online, but you have to understand that this is a factor now, and actually it's a helpful factor. It's helpful to get audiences in their seats at the theater. So if people are interested to see that show and that front of house experience, I mean, we don't want people taking pictures during the show, but we've seen shows now where that front of house has become widely Instagrammed, and Waitress was an early one. But I think it's important. I think theater also, it's just important to have people going, and if that helps us get them in those seats, then it's great. And as long as they're crediting it properly. And that's when I've had conversations with the union about how can we make this something that you find acceptable, but then that the audience also feels that they have the liberty to do so. And it's about proper crediting. So in those early days at Harvard, they put little signs on stands at the front of the deck, and they would say, if you please take pictures, please credit the Loeb Theater, ART, Scott Pask Studio, and just make sure you give the credit where the credit is due and don't take credit for the work. It's more of that. And then you do find that, the more that things are out there, things do get duplicated. So you do worry about productions around the world that aren't licensing your work, that are being, your copyrighted intellectual property, which has happened before. So, but it's a factor. Oof, girl. That's why that's not up here. Every once in a while you have a show that is just hard work, and that's one of them. It was a lot of people that were great on that show, but it had automation troubles, and some people, it was a very difficult process.
Which show? What show?
The musical 9 to 5. Anyway, enough said. I am a very firm believer of we all learn from that, but that was like a collective, I think, perfect storm. And also out of town doing something that ambitious. When it came into town, it was fine, but you really find the chinks in the armor when it's not, when everybody is not following like their proper path, and it happens really quickly. Opening night, that thing was, it had 37 automated effects that happened within the first moment of the show to transform from a blank stage to the office. Lifts and so much stuff, and one caster had a bit of rubber. Someone had changed it that day and did not put an industrial caster on the office unit. So it stopped the whole bloody thing on opening night. But everybody used to love it because Dolly would come out and sing. So people would show up on those previews because they wanted Dolly to sing and just would pray for it to break. But we got that figured out pretty quick. But anyway.
So Scott, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for being here at lunch on a gorgeous day.